many of us are sometimes less aware of how they started. So they actually have quite an old origin, and it's pretty unexpected. There was this tradition in the 1800s in the US of something called a side hunt. And it was a very much of a Christmas tradition among certain, classes in America. And people would literally choose a side, like a team almost, choose a side, and go out on Christmas Day and competitively shoot as many little creatures as they could, and then compare their scores to determine who the winner was. So this was known as a side hunt and was associated with Christmas. So in 1900, Frank Chapman, who's an ornithologist, suggested a new approach. He probably felt as horrified as the prospect of killing as many little birds and squirrels as we feel, and decided to suggest a new approach of doing a Christmas bird census. So change the tradition, keep it associated with Christmas, keep sort of the competitive aspect of it, but change it to literally just sort of looking for birds and counting birds. If you're interested in the history of this, there's a really great online article from the National Audubon Society going into all the details of this. But this is right here a shot of the article that he ran in a magazine called Bird Lore, which was an early version of the Audubon magazine, where he's literally laying out, we need to do hunt for birds, but by looking at them and counting them, not killing them. So it's a really interesting story of sort of a shifting of tradition. It explains why this bird count is associated with Christmas. So here's some numbers on the Christmas bird count. It is the longest running citizen science survey in the world. And the very first count happened on Christmas Day. I'm sorry, what was that? Christmas Day, 1900. And the very first count had 27 people in 25 locations in the US and Canada. And that very first count, they counted 18,500 individual birds of 90 species, which seems pretty good to me. But then you can see how it's grown. So because very conveniently the first count happened on 1900, when they number the counts, that's how many years the count's been going. So the 101st count was 2000 to 2001. And the reason it spans 2 years is because the count period goes through the new year. So it's always the end of 2000, the very beginning of 2001. So that's the 101st count. And up to 1,800 locations. And then the 2012 to 2013 count had over 2,000 locations. So the count has really, really grown dramatically. Okay. And it's a really important outreach tool. So it's a great chance to get new birders and young people interested in birds and conservation. And I think it does a really good job too, imparting onto the birding public and kind of the general public the importance of and the principles of citizen science, where sometimes not finding birds is a very relevant, it's extremely relevant data point, 0, and it can go by a species. So some years in the Tucson bird count or Tucson Christmas bird count circle, we have lots of vermilion flycatchers, and then some years we have fewer. That's really important to track that sort of thing. And this data does directly contribute to science and conservation. It is a very fun, very social, recreational activity that pulls in a lot of different people, especially more recently. This is a great set of photos from National Audubon showing the folks participating in a very early count and then in a more modern count. And that data, though, really does help support a lot of different studies. I know Troy and I both have utilized that data for studies and projects that we've done. So another good thing to keep in mind about a Christmas bird count is what the heck it is, how it's organized. So these maps are showing that it's literally a circle. So this photo on the bottom right is a map of the Appleton-Woodall Christmas bird count now in Elgin, and it's literally a 15-mile wide circle that is drawn on a map. And on the day of the count, this always has Christmas bird counts happen within a day for the main data set. You have teams, you have a person in charge of the circle, and that's why they refer to it as a Christmas bird count circle. It's because it's literally a circle on a map. And people go out in teams and identify and count all the birds that they can find within their section of a circle. And then the data for the entire circle is collated together and submitted to the National Audubon Society. So there's a lot of preparation and work that goes into, especially from the count leader, that goes into making sure that everyone knows where they're going and has a fun day on Christmas bird count day for that circle. So it's really important to know your assigned area. If you sign up for a Christmas bird count and you're on a team or you're assigned a section within that circle, it's really important that the person running the count gives you good maps, that you have multiple copies in case the one map you have blows away when you're out there. And it's really important to know your assigned area. You don't want to be overlapping into other people's areas and birds get counted twice, that kind of thing. You don't want to miss really important spots. And you want to review your assigned area via Google Earth and as much as you can, because really sometimes looking at the satellite imagery is really helpful, and access can be quite important. Now, this is something a count leader should have a really good clue on and let you know as a team member if there's going to be access issues. But sometimes things just pop up that are different, you know, for this year, where you're trying to get to a pond that everyone's been able to count in the past, and you're not able to because, you know, ownership has changed or something. So sort of scouting that stuff ahead of time and making sure that you can reach some of these really key spots can be very helpful and make the day of a lot more fun. And you want to really pay attention to varied habitats where you want to visit them throughout the count day. And we're going to talk about some of those strategies a little bit more on the next slide, but there's a lot of strategy involved on getting the most out of your Christmas bird count day. And bodies of water and marshes are particularly important, especially in Arizona in the winter, because these counts are always, you know, associated with Christmas, and we get a lot of ducks and waterfowl in the winter. And those bodies of water can really help you turn up some really good species. So having really good maps is so important, and having them be in physical form, I think, can be very important too, in case you can't get signal, or logistics logistics are important and have to be thought about. Do you have anything to add on this slide, Troy?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. It's again, it's just this slide you have here is actually really good, just showing how many different habitats to visit in a very small area. And this is true. This actually is within a Christmas bird count area.
Yes. Yeah, and you can see here, you might, you know, when you first start on your area, like, wow, there's not that much here, but if you check it out beforehand on satellite imagery, you can see there's a lot going on. You got Sonoran Desert area, some open river channel, agriculture lands, which can be very important, and open water. And then, of course, riparian zones. That's where all your warblers are going to be hanging out, you know, for the in the winter, hanging out in the willows and plants like that. So scouting really is key. You really want to determine if access has changed or if you need permission. And also sort of where concentrations of birds are and the best area to start or end your day. You really want to put as much strategy into this as you can to, especially if you're a team leader or a count leader, to really maximize the amount of time you have for the day, for the Christmas bird count day. Okay. And there many circles leaders will do this, where they watch the rare bird alerts, they really do some actual scouting looking for rarities or elusive birds, stake them out, and really try to keep a handle on where they are so that they can be relocated on the actual count day. Now this gets important too, because this goes into the concept of what we call count week. So you have a Christmas bird count circle will have a specific day that the count is going to happen on. And that's the main data set, is all the birds that were found on that exact day, that 24-hour period. But if birds are found, there is this concept of count week birds, where species that were missed on the count day, but were located within the circle, either 3 days before the count or 3 days after the count, can be included in the data set, but sort of with an asterisk that they were count week birds, not during the actual day of the count. And this is important because it helps round out species that likely were within the count circle on the day, but for some reason were missed. So that helps sort of the integrity of the data. So looking back from the, looking back at past counts, like, wow, they had no, Western screech owls at all in that count circle. Like, oh wait, they had one on count week. So that helps fill in some gaps that could have happened, and can be really quite important if the weather is terrible on count day, or something happens and a section doesn't get covered, like someone gets ill or something. So this really helps, from a logistics point of view, make up for problems that can happen on count day, is this concept of count week birds. And they're just sort of like, if you've ever done bird surveys, kind of supplemental birds. So they go into the data set, but with an asterisk. Do you have anything to add, Troy?
Nope, I think that covered it very well. And that is the big thing. And you can assume that even if a rare bird or something is found before or after, it was probably within the count circle that day. So it's kind of, we're just assuming that most of the birds that are found in count week but not count day, they were just missed for whatever reason that day, but we're probably still within the count circle.
Yeah, I mean, they're big circles, 15-mile long circles. It's quite a big area of ground. And it can also be really important to sort of know your team. Make sure, many teams could be friend groups, people who bird together regularly, but it's very common in a Christmas bird count, maybe not so much this year because it is 2020, but in a normal Christmas bird count year, it's quite common for people to just sort of be added together, because it is a really good way for people who are interested in birding or brand new to bird watching, can sort of be paired with an existing team. It's extremely common practice in Christmas bird counts, and really helps, I think, get a lot of people excited and interested in birding because they have such a fun day with birders. But it's really important to sort of have strategies when it comes to your team. So if you have quite a large team, which can happen, it can often be good to split up, especially during those key hours of early morning where you're going to be racking up the most species. So there might be a good strategy of, okay, the 3 of us will go to the golf course, the 3 of you go to, the park, and then we'll meet up again. But it's really important because of logistics, it's kind of easy to lose people or not be able to meet up again. You really have to think about these things before everyone runs in different directions in a very excited way. But it can be very helpful to split up. And it's really important too, if at all possible, that each team have a scope. If you've never used a spotting scope, I can tell you they're pretty darn helpful, especially in the winter, because you get, sparrows sitting on fence wires and hawks in the distance sitting on poles and distant ducks on a pond. And boy, can a scope be helpful. But if at all possible, split up the scopes among the different sort of sub-teams. And you can cover some of these key areas during the best morning hours. And a good thing to do could be like plan to meet again for lunch and then compare notes. Okay, what was seen, what was missed? Let's, oh, we missed this species. And if you need to, you can go revisit a site to try to pick up a missed bird. And it's vital that everyone trades cell phone numbers, or even use radios if you're in an area like, walkie-talkies, if you're in an area that, where cell phones can be a little less reliable. And you definitely, as a backup, want to set a meeting place and time, just in case you guys can't connect, to make sure that everyone reconnects as a team. So I've been on teams where we'll split up maybe just for a few hours in the morning and then spend the rest of the day together, that sort of thing, just to really take advantage of those birdiest hours and hit as many spots as possible. Do you have anything to add, Troy?
No, I think that's good. It is a lot of times where I choose a place to eat for lunch, it's usually a birdie spot.
Nice.
And sometimes it's actually an area that you have a good vantage point of a lot of different things, and sometimes you can just sit up there. It's going to be the middle of the day, so you might want to sit somewhere on a ridge or something if you have that opportunity to just watch for raptors and swifts that might be up that you otherwise might miss.
That's a great idea, Troy. That's a really good idea, because often staying put is a way to see some of those more elusive bird species. When you're running around, there's certain birds that are kind of hard to see that way. That's a really good point, Troy. So where to begin and end your day is another strategic thing you want to really think about. And this is where scouting can come in too. If you've noticed, if you sort of develop a plan while you're scouting, this is when you can execute that. But there's also sort of sub-strategies to think about too. So when it's very early morning, when you're starting your count, it's very, very cold. And just the way we like to sort of, when we see that patch of sun, we want to stand in it in the early morning, birds do that too. So the eastern edges of stands of trees are the first to receive the sunlight. And that's often where the birds are hanging out first. Because just like us, they want to catch those rays and warm up a little bit. Bodies of water are going to attract birds throughout the day. You could have a flock of ducks or something come into a pond, hang out for a few hours, and then leave. So it's really quite a valuable practice to visit those several times throughout your day and see if anything new has shown up. And you particularly want to do this early in the morning before they take off to feed, and near sunset when ducks come in to roost for the evening. And then, absolutely, this cattail and bulrush marshes will often have huge roosting flocks of blackbirds and swallows. And I can tell you from experience in the Tucson Valley Christmas bird count, it hasn't been the case the last 2 years, but before that, there was these huge, just from scouting, it was known, very large roosting flocks of blackbirds that were hanging out near the cement plant. And it's very difficult to sort of keep track of them throughout the day when they split up into many, many little small groups. But if you can try to get a count on the yellow-headed blackbirds that were roosting there in the early morning when they all take off at dawn and just become a stream of them going through the sky, it's much easier to try to count them like that when they're very cooperatively kind of getting in line and all moving in one direction than to try to count them throughout the day and all the different patches you find them in. So that's something too that's often a strategy that the count circle leader will use. Like, okay, this team is near where all the blackbirds take off. You guys need to be there right at dawn and count them. Yeah, and we had 40,000 one year coming out of that West Tucson roost site. That's a lot. And then swallows, there are, especially in Arizona, this probably isn't the case in most parts of the country, but for our Christmas bird counts, you can get swallows in the winter, and they're going to be most active over bodies of water, and within an hour of sunset is a really good time to try to look for them. But I've seen them throughout the day coming over water. Do you have anything to add, Troy?
No, that's good too. Other than those cold early mornings and sun. To me, the worst Christmas counts is when there is no early morning sun, when you have a cloud cover, because the birds just don't sit up. They're quiet, and it's very tough birding on a winter morning when there's no sun to help warm up things, because the birds are less likely to sit up. The birds are less likely to make noise because they're trying to keep what body temperature they have, and without having the sun helping warm them up, they're just going to be more reclusive and harder to come by. So I always hate it when I hear that it's going to be cloudy in the morning.
Wow, yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Let's see here. So this is one too that I learned about this on Christmas bird counts when I first started birding, is owling and rails. So these are ones that I think are really easy to miss normally on a count, unless you go to special effort to try to count them, try to find them, confirm them, and count them. So calling for most owls and rails is best 1 or 2 hours before sunrise. So some of these counts, you will have dedicated teammates that go out before dawn listening for owls calling. And smaller owls are a good one for this, but you really want to keep in mind elevation. So western screech owls tend to be below 5,000 feet. Now, if you're in southeast Arizona, down of sort of like Tucson and then south and east of Tucson, you can get whiskered screech owls, but they tend to be above 5,000 feet. So they're very elevationally stratified with western screech owls. And then, of course, northern pygmy owls can be in a lot of different habitats, especially sort of forest habitats. And they'll call through the morning as well. They'll call once the sun is up. But the western and whiskered screech owls are mostly going to call before dawn. And you can do calls, you can imitate their calls to try to get them to call back and reveal their presence so you can count them. But it's also really important to be thinking about things like great horned owls, which often call on their own. This is the time of year where they call quite a lot in the winter. And if you go out, some people will wait till midnight of the count day and listen for great horned owls, and then maybe go back to bed and get up again for the morning count. But or just going out a few hours before sunrise, you can listen for great horned owls. Now, soras and Virginia rails can be hanging out in cattails and bulrush stands, and they may respond throughout the day. And I remember the first time I saw this, and I didn't know what the birder was doing, but you'll see birders go to the edge of like a wetland where the cattails and bulrushes are and start clapping their hands really loud. And they're trying to get a sora to respond or perhaps even a Virginia rail. But strategies like this really help you find these birds that are very difficult to see normally, but can reveal themselves with their voices. Do you have anything, Troy?
Yeah, and the same thing with the owls, the small owls, is playing calls to try to get them to respond early in the morning if you don't hear them on their own. I typically don't do the larger owls, the great horns and things like that, because they're usually, if they're around, they're usually calling on their own. Plus, the smaller owls are less likely to respond back if they know there's a great horned owl in the area, because great horns will predate on them.
Very good advice. Yeah, and I've had luck with Virginia rails calling back just by playing the Virginia rail calls from my app. You know, so there's free apps for those who aren't aware. There's birding apps you can get on smartphones that have calls in them with, you know, associated with the species.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll play Sora and get a Virginia rail to call back, and vice versa.
Nice.
Sometimes the opposite will call back.
That's great. But knowing what those calls are before you go out in the field can be super helpful too, because they're pretty distinctive. Now, day roosting owls is something that can also help turn up some new species on your day, and you really need to have a good sort of mental picture of where to look. So both barn owls and great horned owls like to roost in abandoned buildings, or, you know, very quiet buildings. I've seen barn owls in bell towers that aren't abandoned but just don't have people that go in them very much. And then things like long-eared owls will hang out in really, really dense vegetation, but you want to look out for clues too. There can be concentrations of whitewash and pellets from when the owls, you know, eject the bones and stuff from the prey they've eaten. And looking under bridges and in structures, dense isolated trees or stands of mesquite thicket or really dense tamarisk. Also, large mistletoe clumps. I have flushed barn owls out of really, really thick mistletoe clumps. And hanging broken limbs with dense dry leaf clumps can be where owls are roosting as well. Do you have any advice on this, Troy?
Yeah, and just thinking about during monsoons, we get so many monsoons that say like cottonwood branches and parts of willows will get broken and fall over that are fully leaved during the summer times. So a lot of times they don't drop those leaves, and so they stay in a dense brown clump there. And I've several times I've actually found saw-whet owls roosting in those dense brown clumps. And the way I knew that they were there is just because of all the whitewash that was underneath those brown clumps. And so it's one of those things that's, if you knew there was a lot of whitewash, I just had to look up to where the whitewash was and look in that clump and see them roosting in there. It was just a regular roost for them every night, to the point that it just started collecting underneath.
That's great, Troy. So yeah, it's so exciting to find an owl in the field. So really watch out for those clues.
Excuse me, Jen and Troy. One quick question that came up that actually really applies to what you're talking about now. With rails and owls, federally protected species such as T&E species for spotted owls and ridgeways, about the use of playback, if you wanted to make a comment on that.
Yeah, those are species that, as Chrissy mentioned, are federally protected, and playing callback for them anytime is considered, can be considered as take, or at least harassment of those birds, and which is can be against the law. So just certain species we should never be playing call playback for, unless you're doing specific surveys for them that you are permitted for and have training for.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. And all the birds we've mentioned here that we mentioned in the text and on the slides are birds where that is not the case. You can play calls for these guys, but we always want to be very judicious in call playing in general out in the field, and doing it as little as possible, and especially avoiding the breeding season, which is helpful that this count is in the winter. But yeah, we always need to be careful playing calls. And then in some species, of course, it's actually against the law. So yeah, that was actually a very, very good question. So I did check, Troy, and this app is still available. There is an app called Count Circle that some people get, and it can be really kind of very useful. It has official CBC circle boundaries within it, and then you can view different map layers on your phone zoom in and see where your current location is in comparison to the circle. It's kind of fun too, because you can also make your own circle in this. Like you could make your house the center of like a hypothetical Christmas bird count circle. And I know some people do this for just sort of birding fun, where they'll set a circle around their house and see how many birds they can get in a year, kind of thing. It's kind of fun. But there are smartphone apps that do support Christmas bird counts, so it's kind of fun. And if you're interested, that is a app that is still available both for Apple and Android. And a really important, very fun app that I find very helpful for all of my birding, but especially during Christmas bird counts, is the eBird app. So one of the handouts that's on the link that Chrissy shared talks about how to eBird your Christmas bird count data. But this app is really an important part of that. You don't have to use an app. You can always just keep track of your birds on paper and then put them into eBird through the website. And we have whole presentations and workshops associated with how to do eBird, but we're just going to sort of just for now talk about this app. It is free, both for Android and Apple. It's from Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who's behind eBird. And you can keep checklists throughout the day. So rather than keep one long list on paper where it's just a list for your entire section, if you use the eBird app, makes it really easy to do individual checklists for each of the major locations that you're going to, which makes your data a lot more helpful for science and for keeping track of where birds are actually located. So then we can keep track of, how many birds were in that exact park that you birded for an hour before moving on to the next. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us again after that interruption that we had on our live presentation. This is now a recorded portion of the second half of the presentation with just Troy and myself. And we're going to share with you now the rest of our presentation on leveling up on your Christmas bird count game. So we were talking about smartphone apps, and specifically the eBird mobile app, which is really a very useful app where you can log your birds as you go. It makes it much more sort of efficient and kind of fun to do your checklist out in the field. And it records sort of your start time and your distance, and you can log your birds sort of easily right on your phone. You always can still use paper if you would like to, and just sort of keep paper lists, and then later go home and use the website. But the app is, if you like using your smartphone to do that kind of thing, the app does make it a little bit easier. And it is, of course, a free app, both available for Apple and Android. Do you have anything to add for this, Troy?
I think, yeah, it's just, this is a great way to have your data available to others, in the future. Because it does go to a much larger database, and it's more specific to location. And because even though the Christmas count data goes into a database, the Christmas count data doesn't go into specific areas. It just takes in the count is the number of birds that were found in the entire count circle, not specific areas. So it's more useful to people if you provide this information as well.
Yeah, it makes it really easy to do individual checklists for each of the areas that you birded, which is just great.
Yeah, and then you can combine them at the end of the day. There's an option there for pulling all that information together to then supply that to provide that to the count compiler for their use for when they're compiling the entire count.
Yeah, that's totally true. You can pull a summary for the whole day, and then you can get all those totals together and just report that. So it's actually really useful on a Christmas bird count. Very, very useful. Okay. So there's other apps and sort of web resources that are super helpful too. We have here some of the first four, some of the most sort of popular and well-known bird identification sort of field guide apps. There's the Sibley one, which you do have to pay for, but sometimes it does go on sale if you don't already have it. Audubon Birds and Merlin are both free apps that you can just put on your smartphone for free. And Merlin has been improving quite a lot, I think, the last year or two. And iBird Pro, which you also have to pay for, has a lot of good resources, pretty much all the birds of North America. So there are some really nice, those are handy always for bird watching, but really handy during a Christmas bird count too. And there are also some really good web resources. So this organization, Arizona Field Ornithologists, has a website that has a really good sound library of audio files that were recorded in Arizona. And they're really very useful. and it's free to use. And then there's a website where amateur sound recorders can put their files from all over the world called Xenocanto, and it's spelled out there on the slide, but it's xeno-canto.org. And if you're not using it for commercial purposes, you can download the MP3s of these audio files and put them on an MP3 player or right on your phone. And sometimes that can be really helpful as a reference, or if you're trying to do what we talked about earlier, like play, a Virginia rail call to try to get one to call back. This is a good resource to get those audio files if you don't have the app, or if you want a different recording than what's on the apps. Do you have anything, Troy?
Yeah, the Xenocanto is great for if you hear something odd, you're pretty sure it came from a certain species, but doesn't sound like a call or that you've heard on the typical birding apps. You can go to Xenocanto, and some species have 50, 100 different recordings, and sometimes you can find that call that you heard specifically on there. So it's a great way. I did that one time with a saw-whet owl. I heard, and I'm pretty sure it was a saw-whet owl, but it was so odd. I had to go on to Xenocanto and go through their files till I was like, oh, that's what it was. It was this certain call that they were doing. So it's a great way of doing it. And another thing with the bird calls is I've found that having those on your phone, even for common species, sometimes come in handy. There's times that I've gone scouting for a Christmas count and may have only had one green-tailed towhee in this one area. And by the time, I get there the count day and I don't see it or hear it, and Pishing doesn't seem to help pull it up, which sometimes does with a green-tailed towhee. But I would play not only the call but sometimes the song. Even during the wintertime, that bird popped right up in the exact same spot. And so I was able to get it for the day that otherwise I would have missed it for the actual day. So they do come in handy even for common species, just to pull them up briefly so you can either hear or see them.
Fantastic. Yeah, and they're really good. Xenocanto is so cool. You can listen to all sorts of calls from all over the world. So yeah, highly recommend, if you're not familiar with both of those sites, to check them out. They're really very, very cool. So I'll kind of transition a little bit to sort of on the day, some of the birding skills that can help make your day really successful. So birders make better ornithologists, and this really is true. People who do bird surveys and stuff, if you enjoy birding and really do it a lot, it really helps with your skill set when you're out there. So in developing techniques to find unusual birds, you'll do a better job at finding and documenting common ones. So this is a thing too. It's kind of tempting sometimes to overlook those mourning doves on the wire when you're out just for your day of birding, but it really is very useful to track all this stuff, especially if you're e-birding it, and especially on a Christmas bird count, which is a survey. It is a bird survey essentially. And you really want to look for birds like Plumbeus vireos, Cassin's vireos, and black-throated gray warblers in Arizona. And also really look out for seasonal rarities, birds that can be quite abundant for us in the spring and summer, but then you see one in the winter and that can be extremely unusual, even though you're used to seeing them another time of the year. And a good example of that is Lucy's warblers. So that's the bottom photo on a little suet block, a Lucy's warbler. There's been one reported just this week in the Phoenix area. And I know I was doing a Christmas bird count in the Tucson area a few years ago, and we had a Lucy's warbler that was hanging out in Sweetwater wetlands for the winter. And that's it becomes a rarity. I mean, they're not that rare, obviously in the spring and summer, but very, very rare in the winter. So being familiar with these really common birds can help you pick out rarities as well as seasonal rarities. Do you have anything to add, Troy?
Yes, and the same thing. We're starting to see a few more Bell's vireos wintering over in certain places too, and during the winter time, they don't sing their song that you hear all the time and are very familiar with. And if you get at most, you may get a fussy note, but sometimes you'll just find them flocking with black-tailed gnatcatchers or something in a wash. And so it's just, you just never know when one of these birds has lingered longer than they normally would, or even trying to overwinter that typically does not even occur in the state this time of year.
Yeah, that's great. Great point. And another thing too that can really be very relevant, especially if your count has some urban, like some urban sections, is recognizing habitats. This can be really important out in the wilds too, but it's especially important in urban spots where there are habitats that just sort of look different. Good bird habitat, clustered vegetation, hedges, roads, clumps of trees. lush vegetation, which indicates water. So along is when you're out sort of in desert areas and you see a lush of small, mesquites or ironwoods, that's going to be indicating a wash or a water, which are just inherently going to have some more food resources. You really want to pay attention to native plants, because that is going to attract more insects and therefore more food for birds. Tall trees can be a good resources for birds, and blooming trees. Now this can really happen in urban spaces where trees from around the world can show up, can be planted, and they will sometimes bloom in an off season. They'll bloom in winter in Arizona because it's not winter where they're from. So you get some of that in some of these more urban spots. And open fields, agriculture fields, can really be a huge magnet for attracting birds. So we have here a list of plants on the right hand part of the slide, and this is really important. And also so this list of plants, you don't have to try to write them all down if you don't want to. If you have access to the handouts that we made available, these are listed on that handout, but also they're just right here on your screen. So native velvet mesquite attracts a lot of insects even in the winter, so it's a really good plant for a lot of these native birds. Netleaf hackberry, native acacias, and paloverdes. So the top of the list are going to be the native plants, but there's a lot of non-native plants that also are very attractive to birds. So tall or clustered pines and other conifers, which are common, at least in the Tucson area, and I'm sure in Phoenix too, in apartment complexes, sort of in the courtyards of apartment complexes. Deciduous trees, especially cottonwoods, pecans, but also ash, sycamore, and elm. Any kind of oak attracts a lot of birds, but also fruiting exotics. So things like palm trees, Chinese pistache, English ivy, pyracantha, especially if you have a pyracantha full of fruit, that is one you really want to watch for things like northern mockingbirds hanging out there, or robins. Privet also can fruit. Carob plant, the flowers, sometimes they flower in the winter, and those can be very attractive as well. Eucalyptus is one that's really surprised me, and I have watched them closely, and you really can find quite a lot of birds in them in the spring, but also in the winter too, because some of them bloom in the winter. And also sapsuckers can be attracted to them. Bottle tree, or like bottle brush tree, can have sapsucker holes, and mixed ornamentals can sometimes be good. And then anthil salt cedar. So this is what we call Tam A at Tucson, where it's a salt cedar, but it's not the shrub kind. It's the variety that takes on more of a tree shape, and that can actually be quite attractive to foraging warblers. And then sometimes lawns can be good too, and we don't think of that as being good, but in the winter, because they're so irrigated, there can be insects there, and birds can be there hunting those insects. Plants to ignore in terms of them being food sources are oleander, African sumac, mulberry, chinaberry, and Australian acacias and sennas. So they can sometimes provide cover, but they're usually not that great in terms of a food source for birds, where you don't really want to spend too much time on them. Do you have anything to add, Troy?
Just in urban areas, I guess the main thing is kind of looking, and you can even see this on if you look at Google Earth in your areas, just to kind of see where there might be concentrations of trees in general, and you just never know. Obviously, some big concentrations of trees are often around university campuses or parks and cemeteries.
Yes.
And even edges of golf courses and things like that. Between the lawns that are manicured, there's often ponds, and there's often vegetation and trees near there that all attract. And the fruiting exotic trees, like especially palms, and as she mentioned, and the pistachio and things like that, and the pyracantha. Maybe even this year it's a good year to really pay attention to there could be American robins, but there could be rufous-backed robins in there feeding on those, and they've been found in people's yards, rufous-backed robins feeding on pyracantha and things like that, and they'll stay in those areas almost on a daily basis until the fruit source diminishes to the point that they have to move on.
Cool. Yeah, that's good. And the thing too to keep in mind, if you're new to Christmas bird counts, is you're not expected to figure all this out the first time you go out there. It's very common for a circle leader to have over time had section leaders creating notes with sort of hints and tricks, and make sure you check this out. So if this is feeling overwhelming, just know that their section leader and the count leader is there to sort of guide teams on what these things are. But knowing this helps you look for these opportunities in the field while you're out there as well. So agricultural lands can also be incredibly productive, and they're easy to underestimate, but you really shouldn't. So fallow fields, which means fields that are no longer being utilized, alfalfa and Bermuda grass can actually be quite productive. In the Santa Cruz Flats between Tucson and Phoenix, those turf fields, sod fields, are a great wintering spot for mountain plovers. So you definitely want to be paying attention to these places. They have a lot of water and can have a lot of food. And the taller, weedier field edges or irrigation runoff drains can also harbor high concentrations of sparrows and goldfinches. These areas get really weedy, and if they're growing up with something like amaranth, like in this top left photo with a Lawrence's goldfinch feeding on amaranth, that area can be totally full of food. And especially in a winter like this, where natural food is going to be thin on the ground, areas like this on the edges of farm fields that are going to grow more weeds than the natural areas are going to be really attractive to birds. Do you have anything to add, Troy?
I think, yeah, and up here in the Phoenix area, we have a lot of Christmas counts that take in agricultural land, and so it's just amazing what those attract. And we may talk about this in another slide, but a lot of our agriculture is still irrigated this time of year, flood irrigated, and those are places that you want to, if you have them on your count day in there, that's excellent. That'd be places to go to a couple of times during the day, because they'll attract. So one part of the day it might be sandhill cranes are out there, and egrets and herons, and then a couple hours later, all of a sudden a flock of ibis will fly in, and shorebirds and ducks, and it just changes by the day. So those, and the flooded fields, they flood them for one day, and then they'll go to the next set and flood the next set, and then and every day it's a different set of fields that are flooded. So if you're scouting and find them, you're hoping that at least one field will still be flooded by the time the count day comes around.
Yeah, great. And it's just, a lot of it's about thinking like a bird and where the birds might want to be. And so much of what drives birds is where there's food, food availability. Speaking of which, so mixed foraging flocks is really something to be looking for. So you want to try to find this phenomenon that happens where different species will gather together in little flocks and sort of move as a group while they feed through the treetops, or that's usually the scenario. So you really want to pay attention for these, because we can find a mixed foraging flock of songbirds, of passerines. There can be sometimes among the common birds rare sort of lingering species, because they want to hang out with friends. This is kind of a thing with a lot of birds, where they don't, like warblers and sparrows, tend to not want to sort of be off all by themselves. And if you're a rare bird, if you're the only white-throated sparrow in the area, you're going to be hanging out with more common sparrows, because these are birds that usually hang out with friends. And key areas to look for are those with lots of cover, multi-structured native vegetation near some source of water. So even a small spring or irrigation runoff, and parks can be really good for this, where you see sort of rows of trees along the edge of a park, especially if it neighbors a natural wash or something. That can really be very good for finding flocks, feeding flocks. And even a single young cottonwood or willow in a stand of exotic residential plants can harbor rare gems, among the more common orange crowned and yellow rumped warblers. So do you have anything on this, Troy? We do have your next slide that shows some of the species.
Yeah, this is great. It's just any type of native vegetation mixed in with exotic, even tamarisk thickets. If there's some cottonwood willow sticking up out of the middle of a large tamarisk thicket, it's amazing what just those few trees will attract and hold on to into the winter that otherwise the birds might have moved on.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how that can happen. So do you want to cover this slide, Troy?
Sure. A lot of times we kind of think of these foraging flocks, and they're almost always small passerines that are mixing in with them, except for the occasional sharp shin or Cooper's hawk that may find the foraging flock. But typically the region they do these foraging flocks is most of the birds are foraging in different ways. Sometimes they're on the bark, sometimes they're out on limbs, but the more birds that are together, there's more eyes out there for predators to watch out for. And they're often calling. Some of the birds will call just to kind of keep contact calls. And the frequent leaders that kind of tell everybody which direction to go are bright-old or juniper titmice, and then mountain chickadees. And a lot of these birds may not be around in the desert regions during the breeding season, but they drop down into lower elevations and will end up in washes, sometimes urban areas, or just lower down in the riparian areas that otherwise they wouldn't be in. And those are often your leaders. They're the ones that make a little bit of noise. And so if you hear those even at a distance, you want to make a special effort to just try to find them if you hear one calling, and just see who's mixed in with them. You just never know. And a lot of the followers are the warblers that we mentioned earlier. And sometimes there's one of the rare eastern warblers that are here that basically is a little lost and spending the winter. Nuthatches and brown creepers and several species of vireos and kinglets and gnatcatchers. I said blue-gray there, but it could be in multiple gnatcatchers and flycatchers as well.
Yeah, that's great. And feeding flocks, mixed foraging flocks, is so exciting when you find them. It's such a great little sort of chaos moment with all these great birds sort of hopping around. Yeah, they're really fun. So you definitely want to keep an eye out for those and listen for those leaders. So pishing goes hand in hand with this sort of concept. If you're unfamiliar with pishing, this is the basics here, and we also have a video showing someone doing pishing that we're going to share with you. But it's basically making sounds, and if you ever run across somebody doing this and you don't know what they're doing, it sounds kind of crazy, but they're basically making sounds that imitate fussing or agitated birds. So usually birds like chickadees, you're kind of imitating those leaders that Troy was talking about, where they'll make these really harsh sort of scolding calls, usually to try to sort of chase off a very small owl, is usually, or a predator that they're not happy with. I've seen birds get very agitated towards snakes too. Something they don't want near them, they will mob it and make a lot of aggressive sounds so that the predator that they're worried about potentially moves on. So you're trying to sort of stimulate that response as well as imitate that response from birds. But there's a little bit more to it. You sort of want to stand near a tree or shrub. You don't want to be just standing out in the open where the birds can see you and birds are smart. They'll figure out that this sound is coming from this person that's not as big a threat as they thought a small owl would be. And you want to be standing quite still, not moving very much, because you don't want to frighten them off. The trick is to sort of make them angry, pretending to be a very small owl, but you don't want to look dangerous enough that the birds actually leave. And you want to sort of make pishing sounds and jointly owl call while you're whistling or playing recordings. And if you're not doing this, you actually are probably missing birds. I've seen this done to great effect at a patch of weeds where you think, oh, why aren't there birds here? This looks great. And then they'll do some pishing calls and some Lincoln sparrows pop up. So if you're not doing this, you could really be missing birds. And it could even pull in species you had no idea were there. And pishing at the edge of promising dense habitat, even if you haven't seen or heard anything yet, can sort of, it's like a way to double check if birds are there or not. And you want to sort of pish loudly at first, and then you want to pause and listen for immediate responses and pish up to a minute with no response, and then sometimes you can still get a bird. So I've seen people do this for just a few seconds and then sort of maybe feel self-conscious or anxious to move on, and then they'll stop when it may have been working. It's just the birds hadn't called yet or become visible yet. So some people are very good at this, where they can whistle like an owl and then make pishing sounds on top of that, which sounds very much like sounds like that, sort of like sounds you sometimes make to try to bring a little house cat to you, like little sounds is part of it. Some people are very good at making those owl sounds themselves, like the person in the video we're about to show, but if you're not, you can't always play from your app a small owl. It has to be a small owl, because if a big owl is going to scare off the birds. An owl small enough that they think they can take on, commonly pygmy owl or whichever screech owl is appropriate to where you are. But you definitely don't want to be doing something like great horned, because one, that might attract a great horned owl and endanger these small birds. But if you're doing this at night, but also, you don't want to scare them off, because if they think it's a real baddie, they're gonna fly off. Do you have any tips on this, Troy, before we play the video?
No, I think that's good. I ask people how many people pish sometimes when I'm out with a group, and just kind of see, and some of them say, yeah, I've never had much good luck with it. And a lot of times it's just following some of these little pointers that a lot of folks didn't know about. Is some people give up too soon, and sometimes it takes a little more effort than what you think it should to pull out what birds are in there. But there's almost always some birds out there that could be pulled in this way, especially when you have a small owl call that you're whistling as well, along with the pishing. It just seems to really make everybody more interested. They want to come in, and they act like a mob. Basically, they're mobbing these birds. They know themselves as a group. One bird pishing at or fussing at an owl isn't necessarily going to make a difference, but if they have buddies that are going to do it, it may make a difference to the point that the owl says, yeah, I don't want to be around here anymore, and may move on.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a balancing act, and it takes some practice. So if you've never had luck with this in the past, if you're fairly confident no one's around you, you're not in the middle of a park or something, I do suggest you go ahead and practice this, because the more you do it, the easier it gets. Yeah, the birds were just absolutely going bananas. And so that was some mountain chickadees and pygmy nuthatches that were really aggressively responding to the sounds of a small owl, that's a pygmy owl in that case, and then the little psh, psh, psh sounds interspersed with the owl calling. So if you get really good at it, like Richard there's pretty good at it, you get a lot of birds. So sometimes I've been with Richard where he does that and nothing happens. So it's definitely, if nothing happens, it's not necessarily you doing it wrong. But it is worth practicing, because it can be very, very useful at times. So that's what pishing looks like. So our next topic is flock sizes. This becomes a real issue in the winter, because this is when we get large congregations of birds like blackbirds, and this can be extremely overwhelming to people sometimes. So what we have here is some information that can be found on eBird. So large flocks of geese or coots or blackbirds can be very, very intimidating, but there are strategies that wildlife biologists use and people who do this a lot use, and this is information that we got from the eBird website. So if you want to see more on this, these photos and this info was gleaned from a really good article that you can search for in their help section on the website about how to more accurately estimate flocks, large flocks of birds. And the thing is, when they're flying, you only have moments to do this. So you have to, going in with strategies, I think can really, really help. And counting by tens for a flock can really help. So sort of as they're moving along, try to see what amount of space 10 birds is taking, what proportion of the flock 10 birds takes up, and then you almost geometrically space out, okay, how many of those groups are in this larger group, and that can really, really help you be more confident in the number you come up with. One of the biggest issues I find with birders counting is birders are often very afraid of over-reporting a number. But when you ask people to guess, guess or use this method, okay, how many do you think is there? And then you've taken a photo so you can actually count them later, people are always way, way under. So if you think it's 100 and you feel like that sounds like too many, it probably isn't. So I know it makes people, they really don't want to report the wrong number, but honestly, going with your best gut, going for as whatever you think the correct number is, using the techniques we're going to talk about right now, or sort of your gut check, that is so much more useful than feeling like you don't want to mess up and not reporting it at all. So definitely trying to get as close as you can, but not being afraid. If you think it's a high number, it is. It almost certainly is. So for the technique on this photo, the technique, you know, if you count the first 10 in the flock, which are in the white circle there, that's going to be your first group of 10. And then you extrapolate it out geometrically, you'd come up with about 140. Now, when someone went through and counted the actual birds in this photo and it was 118, that is very close. Now, I know that sounds like you're off, you know, you're off by more than 20 birds, you're off by 22 birds. But in the grand scheme of things, when we're talking about totals, that is actually very, very close and well within a margin of error, because the biggest differences in numbers are from 0 to 1 and like 1 to a million. So putting an X on something, an eBird, which means you didn't actually do a count, you're just saying presence, you literally have no idea if that's a 1 or a million. So being like 50 is actually so much more useful. Even if it turns out to be, you know, 38, that's so much more useful and close to the truth as you saw it, that's really extremely helpful. And you also, before we move on to how scale can mess things up, do you have anything to add for this, Troy?
I think, yeah, just a little plug for eBird. A lot of people just don't want to, when they have large numbers of birds, they just put an X because they didn't estimate, they didn't basically, they ignored counting them and they just didn't want to put a number down there. But I always tell folks, I said, what if John James Audubon wrote in his notes that he had passenger pigeons that day, but didn't estimate that there were millions going by? We wouldn't have that history, that written history of how many birds were really out there, because passenger pigeons disappeared before, you know, numbers and a lot of surveys were being conducted. And so we now have a history that he counted how many were going by the hour, and so we knew how many were out there. And if he just had a list of the day birds that he had for the day and didn't put numbers for them, it wouldn't have been as nearly as useful and knowledgeable as what it really was with him doing that.
That's a very good point, Troy. Now, this grouping method also works on birds on the ground, but you do want to keep in mind that birds that are further from you, that you're looking in 2 dimensions, both in width and depth. And as they're further away, their depth increases, so as well as their width. So you sort of want to keep in mind that clumps of birds, circles of, you know, like they're doing here in this method of circling groups that are further away, more birds are going to fit in that frame just because of the angle of how far away they are. So you definitely want to keep that in mind and adjust accordingly, where clumps of birds that appear sort of fill the same space to your eyes probably contain more birds. So this is a bit more sort of leveling up technique within doing this sort of geometric grouping in space. But you can just see here that even though the circles are a little bit smaller in the top row, they're further away, so they hold a lot more birds. So just definitely keep that in mind. But even just taking a stab at this is going to give you a number that you can feel confident in. Now, mixed flocks, all the photos we showed before all had pretty much the same species in the field of view. But when you go to a place like this, like a feedlot, you can definitely sometimes see flocks that will have different species mixed in. And there's a strategy for that as well. So you want to sort of do a rough scan of mixed species flock through your binoculars or your scope. Scopes can be very, very helpful here, trying to pick out the rare, you know, bronzed cowbird or something less abundant in the group. And you want to sort of come up with a proportion of each species that's present in relation to the whole. So I usually start with the most common. So in this looks like mostly yellow-headed blackbirds in this photo. So you want to sort of figure out, or no, it's mostly red-winged photos. Oh, it's different photo. Easier to fill in the remaining proportions of the less numerous. So let's say you're looking at a flock and you think it's about 5,000 birds. And this really can't happen in the winter if you're in an area with a lot of food like a feedlot. 5,000 birds, about half of them are red wings, maybe 20% are brown-headed, another 20% are brewers, and 10% are yellow-headed. Then you just sort of break down the numbers from there. So this can be a very useful strategy, especially with blackbirds, but this can also happen in other birds. You can have sparrows that do this, where you get little mixed groups of sparrows hanging out in an agriculture field, and that can be really tough because they're down literally in the weeds, and you'll pish a little bit or something, you kind of hear them calling in there, and then they'll pop up, and you have to sort of just get a sense of how many you think are there total, and maybe it feels like 3/4 white crown and 1/4 brewers, but you definitely want to look at these groups of mixed birds like sparrows pretty carefully, because like we were talking about, when you get rarities, things like white-throated sparrow or golden crowned sparrow that find themselves, get a little bit lost and find themselves out here, they're going to want to hang out with buddies for both safety, like Troy was saying, against predators, but also in terms of helping find where the good food is. They're going to want to be in groups, so that's where you can sometimes find an unusual sparrow hanging out with someone who kind of looks like him or is sort of closely related. Shorebirds do this too, where they'll flock together. You definitely want to really sort of pick through them if you find a little group of shorebirds and see if you can find a more unusual type, and watching for rare warblers among more common warbler species. So you really want to sort of break down the total, but also go to these groups to look for more rare birds. Do you have anything to add here, Troy?
I think, yeah, that'll do it. Yeah, it's with the flocks of mixed birds and things like that. You just have to, just don't assume everything's a white-crowned sparrow, even though that's all you see with your first glance. Just take a second glance through there. Obviously, having more people with you when counting birds really helps, especially when you have a pond and you may have 6 or 7 or 8 species of different birds on there. Have one person next to you say, okay, you take the coots and I'll take the American widgeons and count them going across the pond. That way you can get the counts even more accurate if you have individuals counting different species of birds when they just scan across a pond, and it'll go a lot quicker if you have more people with you.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very, very good advice. And another really important thing, and I sometimes forget this, I have to remind myself of this, is you really want to be scanning the open sky. This is very important to do all day, because I've been in circles where there for sure was a golden eagle at some point up there, but you have to keep reminding yourself, I got to keep looking up and keep noticing if anything's flying over. So you really want to scan open areas with binoculars and maybe scopes if you think you see something. And it's not just raptors, although this is a great way to find that golden eagle for the day, or the osprey, or the turkey vultures are around in southern Arizona in small numbers in the winter. And of course, harriers are around here for the winter, as well as, the falcons, accipiters, and butios. But also swifts. It's when I'm staring at something else through my binoculars in the sky that I notice the little swifts flying around. So, and anywhere like agricultural lands, grasslands, wetlands, open sky, canyons, if you're in Southeast Arizona, the Sky Island canyons, if you participate in a count like the Atascosa's count, you definitely want to be watching the sky, because the golden eagle could come around at any time. And another thing in a count circle like that I've come to realize is that when you see the golden eagle or something kind of unusual like that, keep track of what time you saw it, because others may have seen it too in their sections, and that can help you guys at the end of the day figure out if there was multiple birds. If it's something kind of unusual that's very noticeable, like golden eagle. So you definitely want to be watching the sky to pick up just some really cool additional birds, but also just have sort of just these amazing experiences of seeing these birds fly over. Do you have anything to add, Troy?
Yeah, and related to the rare birds that may go into someone else's area, especially when it's a big raptor or something, keeping note, not necessarily obviously with the time, but also you could even look to see if it was an adult versus a juvenile, because that may help separate the bird that they saw might have been one or the other, and you might be able to determine that you did have 2 separate birds. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Very good point, because yeah, on golden eagles, there's markings on the tail and on the wings that really help you to age them as a juvenile or an adult. Yeah, it's an excellent point. Well, I'm going to share that with my team this year. It's a really good point. You also want to be ready for the unexpected. So when you see rare birds on a Christmas bird count, you have to document them. Now, if you get a photo or a recording, that really helps it make it pretty easy to document your bird. If you don't, then you can still document it. There's a form you have to fill out where you put in details of what you saw on the bird, what it looked like. So you still can do this without a photo or a recording, using old school fieldcraft, but it certainly does make it a lot more fun to share your experience with other people, as well as just make it a lot easier to get everyone on the same page if you have a camera to document it. So some people have really big, expensive cameras, but you can also do a good job with smaller point and shoots. And some of these smaller handheld cameras also do well with doing a video. So if you have a call going, you can just take a video and record that call. But also there's something called digiscoping you can do. If someone on the team has a scope, has a spotting scope, and you get the bird in the scope, you can use your phone. This takes a little bit of practice, so it's worth practicing before Christmas bird count day if you have access to a scope, or if someone on the team is better at doing this. But you literally hold your phone camera onto the eyepiece of the scope, and you can take a photo or a video through your phone, and you're going to get, and it looks amazingly good and large on your phone photo. So that's another good way to document things in the field. You want to go ahead and cover this slide, Troy?
Yes, and as far as photos, just to realize that we're not looking for professional photos to document things, and sometimes we're just looking for some key characteristics of that rare bird. That it could be a blurry picture, but if it shows one or two of the key characteristics, so you know it's not something else, is all that we would need to help document a bird. So, in that respect, when it comes to audio recording. Sometimes you'll hear a bird and you may not see it, but you know what species it is, and it is a rare species. One thing to do is see if you can record it. And again, your cell phone, you can just turn on the video mode of your cell phone, and it records sound, and that might be enough to capture that piece, and enough of it that you're going to document that call, that it can be documented for a rare species, even if you don't see it, or if the species is way in the vegetation and you may see it move around, but you just can't get pictures of it. And if it's calling enough, that may be enough. And again, smartphones, for iPhones, I guess there's voice memos app that comes with the phone. With digital cameras and video audio, I mentioned. A lot of people don't have tape recorders with them anymore, but that is the old school way of capturing some things by sound. And these recordings can be edited afterwards and to reduce background noises if to make it clear. And there are free software downloads like Audacity and Raven that can help you with those kind of things. And then you can also upload recordings for documentation after they're set to eBird lists, and that goes into the Macaulay library there with eBird. And if you feel that they're really good recordings, then they can be sent to Xenocanto as well. And then again, if it's rare enough that for the entire state, the Rare Records Committee, the Arizona Bird Committee, could use that as well to confirm that individual bird as going from just a reported bird to an actual confirmed bird, and be reviewed by the committee.
Fantastic. Yeah, and sometimes a recording is more useful than a photo in documenting some of these rare birds. Yeah, very, very cool.
Yeah. Just taking a photo of the Pidnax flycatcher, sometimes isn't enough for certain species. And if you can tell that it's doing a peep versus a whit, and you got that recording, you can easily identify if can document that it was what you had was a willow fly or a dusky flycatcher versus a Hammond's flycatcher. But same thing with the photos. I mean, you could take a photo of saying, hey, it was either a Couch's kingbird or a tropical kingbird that I had, but it's going to be very difficult to get, unless you got really good photographs, to identify it as such without having a call that you've heard or recorded.
Very good. So here's, if you're really interested in Christmas bird counts, there's a whole paper that was written on this, on how to coordinate, sort of level up the coordination of a Christmas bird count. Now this would be more for a count circle leader. And I mean, some of the most important things that we're going to talk about at the very end are things like announcing the dates and we're going to show you where you can find that information. Recruiting a lot of volunteers. There's been counts that have a lot of great birds in them, but birds get missed because there's just not enough people involved. Organizing teams with sort of confident area leaders that know the area well, providing information, maps, lists, etc., and then compiling and sharing the results with everyone who participated. So a well-run circle is going to be doing all these things for you as a participant, giving you all the information you need. Come on. There we go. So another thing is sometimes Christmas bird count circles can be organized in different ways by different leaders. So the photo on the left is showing the Tucson Valley Christmas bird count circle, which is on the west side of Tucson. And that section 8 on the left map is pretty much the entire Santa Cruz River as it comes through Tucson, which can be a very productive area. And then you can see these sections are very, very large. The map on the right was when the count was reconfigured and sort of the strategy really thought out, and this was redrawn to make sure that every section had some fun stuff for the different teams. So many sections on the map on the right have a piece of the river in them, so then those sections of river can get searched very, very thoroughly by different people. And then different sections of the high elevation, so that green block in the top right of the map is the Santa Catalina Mountains, or at least a section of it, and then those areas can get covered a little bit more effectively and make sure that just there's more teams that can participate this way, and sort of just everyone's then it has a good chance it's finding something really cool and rare and having a really fun day. So a lot of the circles have already moved towards these smaller sections, and even if they have large sections, it's very common for those large sections to be sort of broken down into smaller sections like 2A, 2B. And it really makes it sort of a lot more, increases the odds of every team finding something cool. Do you have anything to add here, Troy?
That's great. Yeah, and some Christmas count areas have some pretty open areas that don't have a lot of access to them. And you may find that certain Christmas count areas, there might be 1 or 2 sections that don't get, unless they have a lot of surveyors, they may not go out to those areas and may not even be covered for that count circle. And some, especially in some of the desert areas, and it's really changed since our drought has hit us, because I have some really desolate areas on one of my Christmas counts that I do that it's mostly creosote. And this time of year, with no washes, no water in any tanks and things like that, and we haven't had any rain out there, that there's just no food out there. And you could go out there and send a crew out there, and they would come back with 5 or 6 species for an entire day. Yeah. And nothing out of the ordinary. And it's not worth sending folks out there. They would never come back. I've never had anybody want to go back out the next year when I did that to them. So it's just kind of like there's just some nowhere lands that sometimes I just don't send folks in, because especially in a wet year, it's different, but in a dry year, it's just not worth sending anyone out to.
Yeah, and this is where strategy really comes in very, very much. So now we thought we would have our final section here of covering some of the tricky IDs, bird identifications, that can happen in the winter in Arizona, and that you're likely to encounter on a Christmas bird count. So cormorants is actually a pretty common one where people really need some sort of extra pointers on how to tell these two guys apart. So neotropic cormorant versus double-crested, they both occur through major areas like Tucson and Phoenix, and as well as some of the more wild areas. So you can find both these guys at Patagonia Lake and various other places throughout the state. And they look pretty darn similar at first glance, but there's definitely things to look for. So this is a neotropic cormorant on the left, and you can see it has, this isn't the best photo, but if you look in your field guide, you'll notice that it has a white mouth edge. So the edge of its mouth is literally has sort of a white border. It has very much a wedge shape at the back corner of its bill, so sort of the back edge of its mouth, a relatively short bill, and when they're flying, this is a really good tip when you see them flying, they have a long tail in flight. And when they're flying, that long tail and that long neck together make the bird look relatively balanced, which is different in double-crested. So in double-crested cormorants, which is overall a larger bird, they also have orange lores, and this is actually, especially if you're using a scope, you can really notice this. The lores, which is sort of the area around the eye of a bird, is not really the first thing you think of as a good ID mark for birds, but in these cormorants, it actually shows up quite well, and you can see it in this flight shot of the double-crested flying. You can see that orange stripe going above its eye, and that's what we're talking about. So we have orange lores, rounded back edge of bill, so it's not nearly as pointed, sort of the back corner of its mouth is pointed on a neotropic and more rounded on a double-crested. They do have a relatively long bill. They have a big head too, which really shows when they're sitting there. and a shorter tail in flight. Their tail is relatively shorter compared to the rest of their body, so when they're flying, their neck extending out looks much longer than the tail sticking out the back, and it makes the bird look sort of like front heavy almost when it's flying. It's pretty noticeable when they're flying by, which you do in the evening often see cormorants flying from one body of water to another. Do you have anything to add here, Troy?
Yeah, I always tell people, if you're cormorant flying off in the distance, even if you're just getting a silhouette, if it's shaped like a goose, it's a double-crested cormorant. You know, long neck and short tail. That's just what a double-crested shows you. And as Jenny mentioned, a neotropic cormorant is just better proportioned. And neotropic cormorants overall are just slimmer proportions, slimmer bill, slimmer wings, slimmer neck. Than what a double-crested is. And so, yes, the bare, there's that bare orange space or skin above the eye on a double-crested, and on a neotrop that's feathered. So that's why it doesn't show up as anything. That bare skin is actually feathered there, so you don't see that.
Excellent. So that's very helpful. Now, this next slide works a lot better with a live audience, but we're going to give a moment for you in the video audience to take a look at this photo and try to decide which cormorant you're seeing here. So, and I'll tell you now, it's a trick question because they're both here in this photo, both species. The vast majority of the birds here, the ones sitting, all the birds except the one to the furthest right. So all the birds to the left are neotropic cormorants. And you can see they're smaller. They have sort of smaller heads, and these are birds that are sitting, so that long tail versus short tail thing isn't that useful, though it's very, very useful when they're flying. But especially the bird on the furthest left, you can see it's got a really pointy corner of its mouth. That back corner of its mouth is very, very pointed. You can see the white edging, and you can see the feather, the dark feathered area above the eye. And all his little buddies sitting near him are also neotropic cormorants. And this one on the furthest right, which is considerably larger than the other ones, is our double-crested cormorant. And you can see the orange above the eye. You can see that longer bill and the fact he's just a bigger bird. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts on cormorants, Troy, before we go to our next bird?
No, I think that's good.
Yeah, and they do hang out like this sometimes in mixed groups. I have seen this many times with little. Yeah,
this looks like Patagonia Lake.
It is. It is a photo of Patagonia Lake, and so sometimes if you get one in the scope and like, oh, it's neotropic, it's worth looking at them all quickly to make sure that there's not a double-crested mixed in there as well. So warblers, yellow-rumped warblers is probably our most common winter warbler, and there are two subspecies. So for those who are kind of new to this, these are not different species. These are subspecies of a very widespread warbler through North America. And the two subspecies are roughly split sort of east-west. So in the west, our more common yellow-rumped warbler is the Audubon's variety, which is this photo on the left. Now, I worked overtime to find the drabbest photos I could of these, because these are the most challenging ones, where the one on the left, so an Audubon's race of a yellow-rumped warbler should have a yellow throat. So generally when you look in your field guide, you'll see that sort of the western yellow-rumped warblers, the Audubons, have a yellow throat patch, and the myrtle, the eastern subspecies, have a white throat patch. But this isn't always helpful if the birds are like a first-year female or just sort of a very wintry, sort of drab winter plumage bird, and they don't always show the yellow on the throat, the Audubon's one. So there's some other features you can look for that are less obvious that really help you split these two apart. So the more common one here on the left, the Audubons, they do not have an eyebrow. They both will have a nice eye ring, but they don't have an eyebrow, whereas you can see here on the photo on the right, you know, spoiler alert, they have an eyebrow. And then the throat patch on these birds is a little bit more circular. And what I mean by that will be apparent when we talk about this next one here, which is the myrtle. So the photo on the right of the two birds feeding it a suet feeder, I believe this was at the Patton Center down in Patagonia. This is actually a pretty rare bird. And they're worth documenting. If you find a myrtle yellow-rumped warbler, this is essentially an eastern warbler that is here in Arizona. And if you can get a photo, or at least get a description so you can put it in your data, it is useful to know, even though they're not a full species. And they do have some differences apart from the yellow and white throat patches. So these birds here on the right, especially the one on the left side of this photo, on the right photo, has a really noticeable white eyebrow above its eye, and that is classic myrtle mark. And then also the way the bottom edge of its throat patch, its little white throat patch, is kind of wide and kind of going almost into a stripe, creating almost a cheek patch. That's a good marker for myrtle. Whereas the bird here on the photo on the left, the sort of the paleness of the throat patch is making more of a little circle bib under its chin. And then when you see that in the yellow on a yellow-rumped warbler Audubon's subspecies that has a yellow throat, it really is like a nice little yellow circle right on its throat. And when they're pale like this, their paler color follows that same pattern. And the myrtles, the bottom of the throat patch is usually quite wide, and it doesn't really look much like a circle. So this is a really good way to tell them apart. Now, they often have, the Audubons will have some yellow on the throat, but if they don't, these are some markers you can use to sort of tease them out, separate the two. Do you have anything to add on these guys, Troy?
Just that the myrtle yellow-rumped warbler, I always look for that white throat continues and wraps around that dark auricular patch that's on that basically surrounds the eye there. It wraps around, and you will not see that on an Audubon. So Audubon's doesn't come around and wrap around that color. That white color doesn't come around there. So that's something to watch out for them. And
it almost joins the eyebrow.
Yeah.
Making almost like a little dark ear patch. So yeah, it's really quite noticeable when you see it in person on a good myrtle. Now you can get birds that sort of are intermediate between the two. And that's kind of what this guy on the right looks like he has going on a little bit. He has an eyebrow, but it's pretty pale. His throat patch isn't really going out very far. And so this could well be sort of an intermediate between the two.
Yeah, and it could be an intergrade. Yeah. You know, the intergrades do happen. And one of the reasons that we talk about subspecies is on Christmas counts and even an eBird, they do have space for separating them if you can separate them. And even on a Christmas count, there is a space for myrtle warbler and Audubons if you separate them. And
yeah, so it's good to know this too. Yeah, knowing what people are talking about when they talk about Audubon's warbler. Like, I've never heard of an Audubon's warbler. It's a subspecies of these yellow-rumped.
Yes, and if you're as old as I am, they were separated. Back when I started birding, they were separated as separate species, and they lumped them together. And there is still some discussion that they may be split again.
Right, so it's another good reason to learn these now. Yeah, these could be full species again. So gnatcatchers are another really fun bird to encounter out in the field. And there are 3 different gnatcatchers that you can encounter in Arizona, but the third one is pretty restricted to very specific areas within Southeast Arizona. So we'll start with the 2 common ones, which are the blue-gray and the black-tailed gnatcatcher. So gnatcatchers are tiny. They're very, very small, like verdin size, very, very small birds. And the blue-gray and the black-tailed both can be found in lower elevations in the winter. So I am speaking more from a Southeast Arizona perspective, Troy, so correct me if it's different up in Phoenix, but down here we pretty much only see blue-gray down in the lowlands in the winter. So for Christmas bird count time, they're both around. So knowing how to tell them apart can be very helpful. So, and we're not counting on the breeding plumage marks of sort of the black marks on the faces of the males, which also doesn't help with the females. So blue-gray has a fairly long bill, primarily white undertail of a folded tail. So these 2 photos show the birds perched where we can see the underside of their tail while it's folded. Now, the good thing about gnatcatchers is they love to sort of flip their tail around a lot. So if you watch them, you often can get a look at the underside of their tail. And in a blue-gray, the underside of the tail appears mostly white. And in a black-tailed, the photo on the right, it appears mostly black, hence black-tailed gnatcatcher. And the tail tips on a blue-gray, the photo on the left, a blue-gray gnatcatcher, the tail tips are less graduated. And that's going to become important for our next slide. But notice how the feathers that are sort of on top, the tips aren't as far away from the very tippy tip. They're actually pretty close. These are sort of nearly the same length. These shortest tail feathers compared to the longest tail feathers are actually relatively close in length, and that they're pretty widespread throughout Arizona, especially in the winter. I think below the rim, especially in the winter. Now, black-tailed gnatcatcher have a very small bill, they are primarily black under the tail, and they often have these white tips, these sort of white spots towards the tip. And also, even in the winter, they tend to be in sort of classic desert habitat. They're not so much hanging out in urban areas so much, or sort of mid-elevation. They tend to be in that desert scrub. Do you have thoughts on these two guys, Troy?
Yeah, for us, I always think of one thing with black-tailed tailed gnatcatchers is they're not migratory. They don't move much at all, and they stay on territory throughout the year. So if you have one black-tailed gnatcatcher, you will often have two during the wintertime, because the male and the female stay together all the time, and they do defend their territory. And so you won't typically see a group of black-tailed gnatcatchers together even during the wintertime. And a blue-gray, if you have 3 or 4 gnatcatchers together, a lot of times those will potentially be blue-gray gnatcatchers during the wintertime. And blue-gray gnatcatchers for us in the desert areas are typically near water, and often with riparian habitat. They'll sometimes be in the larger washes with lots of woody vegetation. But if it's just general desert, just general washes, you don't get a lot of blue-gray gnatcatchers at the lower elevations in those habitats. They're usually almost always near some type of water with native cottonwood willow or even tamarisk mixed in there, is where you'll find them. And sometimes you'll get flocks of them in certain areas in that respect. But blue-grays are almost always in just more deserty areas and more open habitats.
Excellent. Yeah, those blacktails, they love the desert. That's really useful. And speaking of how important habitat can be, the third gnatcatcher that is possible in extreme sort of very, very specific parts of Southeast Arizona is black-capped. So this is one that's pretty darn rare, but does turn up in some of these count circles. So these are going to be a bird that's very much tied to sort of Mexican thorn scrub habitat. There's almost always hackberry trees nearby. So there's some known populations of these birds in like Proctor Road, at the base of Madera Canyon, off of Box Canyon, at Patagonia Lake State Park, and in the Atascosas. You can find them in places like Sycamore Canyon. Yeah, so it's definitely kind of range restricted, and then very, very location restricted within that range. But there are also some physical things you can look for. They have a very, very long bill for a gnatcatcher. So you can really see that bill is just really quite long compared to the other two we were looking at. So let's look at those bills again. These guys, I mean, they're long, but they're long. It's much longer in a black-capped. They do have a white undertail, similar to the blue-gray when it's folded with this little black stripe down the middle. But also take a look at these tail feathers, the graduation of them, which is why we pointed that out for the blue-gray. The shortest tail on this folded undertail is significantly shorter than the sort of tip of the whole tail. And then, of course, that limited habitat is really key. But with gnatcatchers, another element that really helps, besides the sort of physical or what you can catch in a photo, is the way they sound. So here's a recording of a black-tailed gnatcatcher. I got all 3 of these recordings from Zeno Canto, and all 3 of these guys are associated with. So sound is very important for black-tailed gnatcatchers. So right here we have black-tailed gnatcatchers. Let's listen to that. So that's such a sound of the desert, that little sort of real repetitive, steady kind of Z, almost like a sigh, just a really steady sound, very much a sound of the desert. I did get all of these sounds from Zeno Canto, and it says the names of the people who recorded them and the dates, which is enough to find them yourselves on Zeno Canto if you'd like to, and download them. So now let's listen to blue-gray gnatcatcher, sort of in the winter, one of the most widespread through different habitats in the lowlands. So blue grays always have that really whiny kind of tone. They always sound like they're sort of complaining, like filing a complaint with you about something. Just real whiny, kind of some different sounds they'll mix in there, but just real whiny tones. Let's just listen to the beginning of that again. Real squeaky, real whiny, not as repetitive and steady as the black-tailed. And then black-capped, again, Southeast Arizona, super restricted, and even then, because it's very much a classic Mexican thorn scrub species, and then really sort of within only specific spots in Southeast Arizona. But their call is very, very distinctive. So it gets a little bit louder there in the middle, but just a real sort of kind of rising and falling Z, Z, Z kind of, it's very emphatic. It's pretty attention grabbing when you hear it. And it really is the most common call they make. So those are our 3 sounds of the possible gnatcatchers of Arizona, with black-tailed being very much restricted to desert habitat, and blue-gray being on the lowlands and the wintering more widespread and associated with riparian especially, and then black-cap being super specialized as a Mexican species.
That'll do it. It's call is something, but I mean, obviously it takes some experience having with those to identify them. But if you're really familiar with black-tailed gnatcatchers, I think the others will pop up as sounding different for you. If you're a desert person and you hear black-tails a lot, you'll understand when the other 2 are calling that doesn't sound the same.
Yeah, great. So gnatcatchers are such a cool bird, and it's always fun to encounter them out on a Christmas bird count. So our last tricky ID we want to cover is a classic, the sharp-shinned versus Cooper's hawk. So these are both accipiters, and they look really quite similar. And in the winter, we do have both of them in Arizona. So down in, certainly in the southern part of Arizona, down in the Tucson area, we don't really have sharp-shinned so much in the spring and summer. If at all, but in the winter, they are both here. So Coopers we have year-round, and then sharp-shins come in for the winter. So knowing how to tell them apart is very relevant for a Christmas bird count. So these are 2 flight shots of sharp-shinned on the left and Coopers on the right. Both of these photos are of a juvenile bird. So they have the sort of brown streaks going sort of, vertical up down the chest. These are both juvenile birds, but still the differences here, how you tell them apart, still work in this plumage. So sharp-shinned hawks are smaller than a Cooper's hawk, but there is a little bit of overlap from the sort of largest of the sharp-shins and the smallest of the Coopers. There is some size overlap, and also size is just so hard to tell apart in the field when you don't have a good point of reference, like when the bird is flying over, like in these photos. But there's still some physical differences you can look for. So when they're flying, a sharp-shinned hawk has a much more squared off tail end. It's almost square on the end, whereas a Cooper's tends to have a more rounded tail end. And then sharp-shins, the heads are noticeably different on these birds, the shape of them. So sharp-shinned hawks have these little tiny head that kind of pokes up above what I kind of think of as the shoulders, where the wings connect with the body of the bird. So kind of their shoulders, there's just a little head popping out, whereas a Cooper's has a much larger head, but there's also some neck extending beyond that front edge of the wings. And so the wings kind of connect at the chest, so you have a little bit of neck sticking out, and it is noticeable in silhouette when they fly through. So when they fly through quickly, really look for that the shape of the tail end and how much head is extending beyond the wings. So we have perched photos next, but do you have anything on these flight shots, Troy?
Nope, I think that'll cover it. Very good.
So here they are perched, and I have had people say, I feel like when they're perched, they're much harder to tell apart. And it's an interesting thought. Now, first of all, both of these photos are of adults. So this is what they both look like in adult plumage, where they have these darker caps and wings, and they have this sort of red and white barring going horizontally across the chest. So when you look at them in a field guide, these birds look so similar because their colorations are incredibly similar. But there's some other things to look for beyond color, the shape and structure of these birds, that really helps set them apart if you see one perched. So again, the tail ends come in. So if they're perched and you can see the tail end, if there's not vegetation in the way or something, you can see that a sharpshin is also still showing that squared off tip, and then a Cooper's having a round tail tip. Now sometimes if they're molting or something, this isn't that obvious, so there's other things you can look for. Sharpshins have a tiny little bill versus a Cooper's has a much larger, sort of more, you know, threatening looking bill. If you're a small bird, more threatening looking bill. And sharpshin, which is where their name comes from, has these little tiny spindly little legs, very little legs, thin little toes. The structure of their legs is very, very delicate. Coopers have these meaty, strong looking, thicker legs, thicker toes, much more fierce looking feet. Whereas in a sharpshin, their legs and feet look almost dainty. Now, another thing too I've noticed on Coopers versus sharpshins in the plumage is sharpshins have this look of sort of a flat cap, and it's because they have this pale edge on the back of their neck that makes this look more like a straight little cap they're wearing, whereas sharpshins can look more hooded because this darkness extends down the back of the neck. So do you have any thoughts on sharpshin versus coop, Troy?
No, you did very well. That's
thank
great.
you. I've been studying my raptors.
Just mention that sometimes the tail may be squared or even notched for a sharpshin. It's not sometimes if it's notched, which you typically will never see on a Cooper's unless there's some molting going on in that tail. If it's notched, it's another key thing for a sharpshin.
Notch like that. Very cool. Thank you, Troy. So this is a recorded session. So what normally we would take questions from the audience. So what Troy and I have decided to do is to cover some of the questions that we frequently get during our workshops. So okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. That's not really what I wanted. Okay, I want to share this. So now I'm going to pull up what I was looking for. Okay, so now I'm going to share. So one of the questions I get a lot is when are the Christmas bird counts? How do I join a Christmas bird count? Where are they? When are they? I really want to do this. I'm excited. What's going on? So if you go to the Arizona Field Ornithologist website, right on the home page there, we have a link to go to let me just show you what that looks like. So from our homepage here, we have a link right here, 2020 to 2021 schedule, and we have listed here all of the Christmas bird count circles. So there is a link here to look at a map if you would like to see like which circle is nearest where you live or an area you're interested in participating. So you can check out a map. But they're all listed here, all of the circle names, and then the dates that they're scheduled for. So it's very important. These circles happen on a specific day. Now, what's also listed is the name of the compiler, their phone number, and their email. If you look at this map and there's one you're interested in participating in, you're going to reach out directly to that compiler, to that count circle compiler, the leader of that count circle, and tell them you're interested in participating. And then they take it from there with you, communicating with you on connecting you, assigning you an area, or connecting you to another team. This gets tricky this winter because of everything that's going on in the world, but in a normal year, what would happen is if you're a brand new birder, they'll maybe connect you with another team of experienced birders, and this is that social aspect that pulls so many people in on the fun of doing a Christmas bird count. And so this is where you can find that information. It's also available on the Tucson Audubon website, but this is a great spot to come find it for the entire state, is on the Arizona Field Ornithologist website. And every year, we go to the trouble to reach out to all these compilers to find out what date they've chosen and what's going on. So yeah, do you have any other kind of parting thoughts, Troy?
No, I think we covered it pretty well as far as the Christmas counts that are around. Again, just going to that link there that she mentioned for the count circles will help kind of visualize where all the Christmas counts are. And there are new Christmas counts. There's actually at least 2 new ones this year that are coming up. Safford's going to have the first Graham County ever Christmas count. it's amazing. We only have 15 counties in the entire state, and we still have a couple counties. Greenlee County and Graham had never had a Christmas count, so a long-term Christmas count set up. So out of the 15, we now will at least have 14 of them with the Christmas count set up in them.
So here's a sort of a zoom in here. You can see how many are throughout the state. Quite a few. I mean, some parts of the state don't have very many, but these areas that have more folks living in them, like the Phoenix area and the Tucson area, have a lot of counts. And there's some that are more wild too. So there's counts that can be very urban, but they can also be quite wild. There's one out in Oregon Pipe. There's one out in the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge. That's a really fun wild one. And then the Atascosas is a really remote kind of cool one. But then, there's one in the Tucson area that's mostly in the city. So the west one is very much in the city. So there's all sorts of fun, different choices for you. There's some hopefully very close to where you live. There's a portal count in the Chiricahuas. So there's sort of some that are a little bit more adventurous and wild, and some that are quite urban and focus on city birding, which can be quite good. You can find a lot of rarities pop up in cities and urban spaces. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation on Christmas bird count strategies and what Christmas bird counts are, as well as how to tell some of these sort of tricky winter identifications apart. Do you have any final thoughts, Troy?
No, I just hope to see a lot of people out there. Again, it's going to be a little odd year just because of COVID and restrictions and people driving alone. But usually we always encourage people to carpool and things to the Christmas counts. But this year some things we're going to have to do a little differently, and hopefully we'll be closer back to normal next year when COVID will hopefully be something that we don't have to deal with as much as we are this year.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you all so much for bearing with us and watching the rest of the presentation on video after our very unexpected interruption. But I hope you guys enjoyed seeing this second half of the talk. Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Troy. It was great presenting with you.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Okay. I'm going to end the talk now. Thank you so much, Troy.
Yes, thank you.